Good evening, everyone. Most of you know me, but if you don't, my name is Carolina Lethka-Bertoloni, and I'm the chair of the Earth, Planetary, and Space Sciences Department. I want to give a warm welcome to the entire EPSS family, valued alumni especially, their staff, and faculty and friends of the department that are here today to continue this great tradition of the Distinguished Alumni Lecture. I'm excited to be here again, just like last year. We did, and actually our distinguished alumna lecturer from last year is here, Hilary Petrizzo, and I'm excited to be here again with you and continue in person. A tradition that I think shows the excellence of the department and the bonds that tie us together. During my tenure as chair, as many of you will know, we've had some serious challenges and tremendous losses, including Professor Anyin. But through it all, the North Star for the department and what has allowed us to keep going has been to preserve the traditions and the excellence of the department. We have had the opportunity to replenish staff and faculty ranks, and we continue in that vein. We're doing 2 searches right now. And we also want to be able to value and honor those who carry our name forward with dignity and pride. Therefore, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce our distinguished alumni lecturer, Dr. Denise Battle. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction, and perhaps not quite so brief because she has many accomplishments. But Dr. Denise Battle is right now the president of SUNY Geneseo, so the State University of New York Geneseo campus, which is really, a small liberal arts college, I've learned today. She's the 13th president and has been president since July 2015, and she's the 2nd woman to lead the college as permanent president since the college's founding in 1871. Her appointment at Geneseo caps a 25-year career as a geologist, professor, and higher education administrator. She's an Oswego County native, and she received her geology degree at Colgate University, her bachelor's degree. But she got her PhD here at UCLA in our department, which at the time I think was called ESS, not EPSS. Right, and she recognized, some of our faculty here today. She hadn't visited us for quite a long time, so hopefully today was a chance to reconnect with people she knew and to learn about more of the new things you're doing. She started her academic career in the Department of Geology and Geography at Georgia Southern University, where she also served as assistant and associate dean. She then served as Dean of the College of Natural and Health Sciences and Professor of Geology at the University of Northern Colorado until 2012, when she was named Provost and Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. And she was there until she assumed the presidency of SUNY Geneseo. During her storied career, she has held many leadership roles in multiple higher education associations, amongst other honors. In addition to, some of them are the president of the Council of Colleges of Arts and Sciences, vice president and president-elect of the Association of Chief Academic Officers. She's on the board of directors of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, and she has an ongoing scholarly interest in science education and STEM, gender equity issues, and has been primary investigator, project director for multiple grants through NSF, including the Advance program at NSF. She has referred to this interest, related to this interest, she served on the editorial board of the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, a publication of the American Psychological Association and the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. And today, given the background and her long career in higher ed administration, she's going to talk to us about the case for public higher education, a personal perspective on a public good. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Carolina, for that lovely introduction, and I'm really thrilled. It's an honor to be here back to my graduate alma mater And as I looked at those who had preceded me for this lecture, I was all the more humbled because there are some wonderfully impressive individuals, including at least one who's in the audience tonight. And when I got the invitation a couple months ago, knowing that I had gotten my PhD, gone into a geological route, but then found my way into administration, I had my doubts. So I called up Gabrielino and I said, okay, I would talk about what I know best, which is higher education. Are you sure you want me? And she reassured me, and so that led to my being here tonight, and it's really been a lovely experience to come back and reconnect with the campus, so thank you. I feel very honored to be here and have the opportunity to address you tonight. So as I alluded to, I will speak about that which I know, which is higher education and public higher education in particular. And because this is a passion for me that comes from a deeply personal place, as the title alludes to, I will organize this around the frame of my own personal and professional journey because it has kind of shaped my thought about my role in higher education. And actually, this place, coming to UCLA, as I'll talk about, this was my first significant experience with a public higher education institution. It was really transformative, and so it helped to shape the future direction of my career, even though at the time I did not know that. And I will give a spoiler alert. Part of the outcome of this presentation is I hope to enlist you in the cause of advocating for public higher education because there is a real imperative for doing so. If it hasn't become obvious, higher education, in particular public higher education, is really being scrutinized and questioned in a way that we've rarely seen before, and so we need all the champions we can get. So let me see if I can advance the slides. Yay, there we go. Okay, well, as you heard in the introduction, I'm a native of upstate New York, and in particular, Oswego is my hometown. And I'm a New York native, first of my family to have experience with a four-year degree. My family had little experience or tradition of higher education. I developed an interest in geology at a very young age, and this is actually a picture along the shoreline of Lake Ontario. It's a rocky shore, and my grandparents had a place along the lakefront, and as a small child, I would wander along that rocky shoreline collecting interesting rocks. And my passion for hard rock was evidenced at a very young age. When I was quite young, unlike all my contemporaries who had the traditional lemonade stand, I sold rocks. So I was out there, I sold rocks, and the granites were 10 times the price of all those soft rocks. So my apologies to the soft rockers in the room, but I grabbed onto that early on. And when it was explained to me that many of the rocks, including my beloved granitic rocks, weren't actually from there, but had been transported by long since gone massive ice sheets all the way from Canada. This was another country, very exotic. My passion for geology, my fascination was developed and sustained through my life. This is a picture, another rocky shore. This is also very close to where I was from, and in fact, this is a picture of the 9 Mile Point nuclear station that is in Oswego County, and I owe my family home to this very place. When they decided to put in this and some other nuclear power stations, as I said, my grandparents owned land along the lakefront. My parents were young, married, broke, with me on the way. They wanted a house. And so when they bought up the land here, it was already populated with structures. My parents offered $105 to buy a house no joke, 105, to buy a house, a little farmhouse that was due to be demolished to create the space for the nuclear power plant. My parents moved the house down the road onto my grandparents' old strawberry farm fields, and that was my home, that rescue home, for the first half of my childhood until I was 9 years old. So this is where I'm from, and the reason I bring this up is that this area was not what one would call economically vibrant. And so it was pretty challenged. And as I looked around in my youth, what I saw were a lot of folks who seemed like they were stuck. My sense was they didn't have a lot of opportunities in life. And I didn't know what I wanted, but I wanted choice. I wanted options in my life. And for whatever reason, I decided education was the pathway to choice. And so at that point, I said, I don't know what I'm going to be. I don't know what I'm going to pursue, but I am going to be as educated as I can, because to me, that means it'll give me options. I can choose what I want. And so that really was the origin for me of a deep love of higher education and education more broadly. Okay, so I liked science, liked geology, also liked art, didn't know quite where I would land, so I chose a liberal arts college. And as you heard in the intro, Colgate was the place where I landed. I will let you find me. This was the time of bad perms, so I will just say, and Hawaii is very humid, I'll also add that. But I went to Colgate, and I want to be clear that I loved my experience at Colgate. I think I benefited tremendously from the environment that I experienced there. Found my way to the geology department pretty early on. The geology department, and I went there, by the way, the beneficiary of a very generous financial aid package. It would not have been possible any other way. And so I went there. The geology department hired me to be a tutor to other students, usually in intro to physical geology. So I got hired to teach others, and that kind of planted the seeds that made me realize I loved teaching geology. They also hired me as an undergraduate research assistant. I got to run the XRF and XRD lab. There were no graduate students, so we were de facto the graduate students. And so I got hands-on experience with major instrumentation. That set me up well for an eventual move to a graduate program. They supported me in a number of ways. I got to go to Hawaii, and the volcano fortunately started erupting about 2 days before we left. January, when you're in upstate New York, the prospect of going to Hawaii seemed pretty good. And so I was able to go there, first time I'd ever been on a plane, and my first real serious experience in a geologic field setting. And so all of that was absolutely wonderful. I will say, though, that my choice of a pricey, selective, private liberal arts college had long-term consequences for me. Among them, I was a work-study student. I said I had financial aid, and I was a work-study student. I held down at various times 5 different jobs when I was there. I also decided, because at that point I had 3 younger siblings, and I didn't want my pursuit of a higher education to come at their expense. I didn't want to foreclose their opportunities. And so I decided, because I could, to accelerate my undergraduate, my time at Colgate. I graduated in just under 3 years. And I also graduated with a lot of debt. I had a wonderful financial aid package, but loans were among them. And I think I'd repress this memory, but I did look back at my loan records. I had 5 different loans. And it was not a huge amount. It's the equivalent of about $23,200 today, but at the time it was a lot of money. It took me 14 years after graduating Colgate to pay that off. I was in the dean's office for 4 years, and I was still sending my checks to pay off my student loans. So it was a great education, but it had long-term implications. The other thing I would note, and this kind of planted some seeds that have informed my career choice, is that I also was pretty aware that I was an outlier. I'm sure it wasn't this way, but to me, comparing notes to my fellow students It felt like everyone else had gone, they came from money. They went to a private school, selective K through 12 school. I was a native New Yorker, never been to New York City, had never been in a big city at all, really. And so I very much felt like I was apart and different. And so again, wonderful experience, but I did feel that sense that my situation was a bit distinct from my fellow students. And so that took me immediately after graduation. I headed to UCLA. And so this, as I said, was my first real immersive experience with public higher education. And I really grew to value and to love it. When I came to UCLA, it was a vastly different experience for me. UCLA, large, urban, diverse in a way that I'd never experienced, international, and a lot more students who were from an SES, a socioeconomic situation that was more akin to my own. Met international students who had overcome incredible odds to be here to pursue their education, and that was very powerful to me. I got to see up front and very close how transformative access to education, affordable, accessible, excellent education could be. And so that to me was extremely important, and it really helped inform my choice to spend my career, 34 years now, exclusively in public higher education. And so what you can see here, a few slides from the time, and when I was in the lab that was formerly Arts PTX shop. This is that very lab. So Craig, Peng, I think this probably, it doesn't look that different, does it? Yeah, it really doesn't. And I'm thinking you may notice there's some faculty emeriti in this picture and former graduate students and all. And I did bring this for those who weren't at dinner. Arts PTX shop. We never fail under pressure, right? So that is my little memento from that time. And you may recognize some of these folks. At the time, as Carolina mentioned, it was ESS, so I had to relearn, and now EPSS. But really enjoyed my experience at UCLA, and very important to me in terms of exposure to public higher education. So I finished my PhD in 1990, and 1990, for those of you who remember it, was an absolutely terrible time to be in the academic job market if you were looking for a tenure-track job in hard rock, which I was. And so I realized that when I went out and applied for about the 5 jobs that were out there, I realized I was getting a more favorable response than a number of my contemporaries, probably because it was a time when there weren't a lot of women in the field. And if you look here, this is the year of my graduation, it was about 20%, about 1 in 5 of us getting our PhDs were women. A lot of these geology departments around the country were saying, hey, we probably need to diversify and have some role models out there, and I have no doubt that I benefited from that. And I'm very grateful for that, and it kind of inspired my interest, as you heard referenced in the intro, my interest in STEM gender equity issues, my interest in career paths and pipelines for women in STEM. And so I was fortunate to land a tenure-track job. This was at Georgia Southern University in rural southern Georgia. And it was not open access, but I would say it was access-oriented. And in going to Georgia Southern, I experienced, again, an environment in which I got to see firsthand how transformative public higher education was. A lot of the students who came to that institution were from the rural, deep South, and very diverse student body, individuals who might not have otherwise found their way to higher education, and it was really very impactful to me. I started out on my faculty career. I was looking to continue what I had started at UCLA. My preferred field area was the Western U.S., studying hydrothermal alteration in Jurassic magmatism of the Western U.S. I did pursue that for a while, but my preferred field area was a 5,000-mile round trip, which was not easy. I was also at this institution. It was a regional comprehensive. We had no graduate students. So I was teaching 15 credit or contact hours each week. We had no grad students, so I was doing the prep, the lab prep, the grading, and all. Didn't leave a lot of time to pursue scholarly interests, and so I shifted with time, I shifted my field area a little closer to home. I moved into science education, and I also started to find myself drawn to opportunities where I could make positive impacts on my department, on the students, on the majors, on my colleagues at scale. In other words, I found my way into administrative roles. And a lot of these had to do with connecting people across departments with funding. So if we had a department that inherited, as we did, the home of the former home economics department, and we were teaching optical mineralogy surrounded by 8 turquoise-colored kitchenettes, the practice kitchen, with bird's eye maple cabinetry. I'm like, hey, gang, I bet if we get together and we write a grant proposal to NSF, they might just fund us. And when we had a new curriculum, and we knew we had to revise our curriculum to come up with these new courses, I'm like, we're going to have to do this anyway. Maybe if we make this a scholarly approach and we go to NSF, maybe we can get this funded. Maybe we can get some lab instrumentation. So I found my way to those sorts of roles, and that really was the initiation of my trajectory into administration. I give that explanation because I had the opportunity to talk to a number of faculty today, and I know for many of you, you're like, why would anybody ever go from a faculty role into administration? It's inconceivable. But that's really what led me to that field, because I saw ways that I could make change at a broader scale and have a tangible impact on our students, on my colleagues, on the broader department and the college. So with that as a bit of context, I will segue into the main focus of my talk, which is public higher education. So start with a brief overview of U.S. higher education in a very short snapshot. But the history of higher education in the U.S. goes back nearly 400 years. Starts with the founding of Harvard, 1636, created as the first college in the United States. And at that time, and it was followed by a number of other private institutions, at that time, higher education was kind of inextricably linked in most cases to religion. And so religiously affiliated, either explicitly or implicitly, the training of clergy. These institutions were generally small and served a very narrow segment of society, generally elite, white, male, Christian, and folks that were really privileged, because if you had an able-bodied 18-year-old-ish son who could work in the field or work in your business, why would you do anything other than that unless you had the means to do that? And so it took about 150 years until the advent of the first public institutions, the first being University of Georgia in 1785. And that marked sort of a movement from being very narrow in the scope of who higher education was intended to serve to a broader array. It was a progression, but it marked really a significant step in broadening access to higher education. About 200 years after Harvard, a little more, came the rise of women's colleges. There was the sense that, hey, maybe the women, we'd like to have them have educational opportunities as well. So mid-1800s, the rise of women's colleges and normal schools. And I'm guessing there are probably some in the audience who hadn't heard that term before. Normal schools, that was the former name of teacher preparation colleges. And so while they certainly included men and women, this was a place where a lot of women received their education. A major step forward in this arc of increasing access was the 1862 signing of the Morrill Land Grant Act. And so this was an act, a federal act, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln at the time. And what this did was it set aside vast tracts of land across the western U.S., made them available to the states so that they could sell them or develop them, exploit them in some way to create the funds to establish agricultural mechanical public institutions, the formation of many of the great state institutions across the country. Now, I need to hasten to add that the federal government gave these lands. They weren't necessarily the federal government's to give. And so there's a very painful and fraught history here. These were generally lands that were expropriated from tribes, from Native Americans. And actually, for those that are interested, within the last 2 weeks, there's been a wonderful piece that came out. It was covered in Inside Higher Ed and Chronicle of Higher Education about these origins. So very painful history here, and that needs to be stated. That acknowledged this did mark a major event in that it was the federal government recognizing that there was a benefit in having public higher education institutions that were broadly available. And so again, this arc of making higher ed more accessible continued. This was followed in 1890 by the Second Morrill Act. And so this one wasn't about land, but it was about funding, and it also acknowledged that the 1862 Act was limited in the institutions and individuals who participated. In particular, generally the formerly Confederate states, the southern states, and individuals who were underserved or not served by public higher education, African Americans. This opened up what are called the 1890 institutions. So this was the origin of many of the HBCUs that historically black colleges and universities that we know today. Another step forward, major step forward, was 1944, the GI Bill established. And this is probably something we've all heard of. At the time, this was formally known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. And so, of 1944. And so it was servicemen and women, I would hasten to add. But what it was, at the end of World War II, the worry was that the country would get inundated by all of these returning young servicemen and women who would have nothing to do. And they were very worried about that. They didn't want a repeat of what happened after World War I. And so they passed this act shortly after at the time that the war was resolved. And so what this did is it gave a series of benefits and entitlements to veterans, housing, unemployment insurance, all aimed to help society readjust to their return. The educational piece was actually an afterthought. They didn't think it was going to take. They didn't think anybody would be really interested. Well, that was one of the big benefits of this act, and in fact, the GI Bill continues, and it's evolved, but it does continue today. So what we have, in short, is sort of an arc of progress in which higher education was being made with time, this is 400 years, more and more available, and it was noted, it was observed that this is a public good. This is something, higher education, having an educated populace, was something that broader society benefited from. I took this quote, and through the day I've met a number of folks with connections to University of Michigan, so you can revel in this. I'll have another one later in the presentation. But this is a wonderful quote I found that kind of encapsulates the philosophy of these large public institutions. And so this is a former president, James Burrell Angell, from University of Michigan, the late 1800s, early 1900s. And his perspective was that these large public institutions, especially the University of Michigan, needed to provide, quote, an uncommon education for the common man, end quote. And if you look, I love this quote, have an aristocracy of birth if you will, or of riches if you wish, but give our plain boys from the log cabins a chance to develop their minds with the best learning, and we fear nothing from your aristocracy. Isn't that a wonderful quote that talks about the importance of providing broadly accessible, excellent education? Okay, and you might be wondering here, where does California fit into this? And I've got a little more at the end of this presentation. But California had the benefit, of course, because of its geography, the rise of its institutions came later. So California got to reference what was happening further to the east and benefit from that. California also, unlike the East Coast, remember, there were 150 years of private institutions before the publics came on the scene in the East. Here in California, they were more contemporaries. So there was a lesser presence of that established network of private institutions here. So California got to look at what had happened elsewhere and benefit from that. The end result being that California has been claimed to be, and I'll repeat this quote, of all states in the Union, California's higher education system provides the greatest success story of a broadly accessible and high-quality network of colleges and universities. And this is from John Aubrey Douglas in his The California Idea in American Higher Education that was published a couple decades ago. But California had a particular opportunity and really pursued that opportunity to great success of higher education in this state. So, talked about the trajectory of higher education, one of growing access, acknowledgement that public higher education is in the public interest. That, of late, has become less the prevailing sentiment. And so I've got a collection here on this slide, which I've entitled The Questioning of Higher Education, some images and some headlines that are fairly recent and kind of encapsulates what the discourse is. There's been a shift from looking at higher education as being a societal good to one that's a private benefit. And why should society invest in something that largely serves the individual? And just a broader questioning and doubt of higher education. This image here at the lower left, I probably don't even need to say much about. It's become iconic. What's interesting to me when I pulled this, this image is less than 3 months old. This was December of 2023. Within a week of this, and you have here pictured presidents of 3 elite institutions, so Harvard, Penn, and MIT. And so within a week of this congressional testimony, one was a former president. Within a month, 2 were former presidents. But it does speak to kind of the active questioning and doubt that higher education is experiencing today. This image that's over on the right may be less familiar to you, but what this represents is a graphic that shows the 50 states. And this is the Chronicle of Higher Education's anti-DEI tracker. They actually keep and update regularly the legislation that's been introduced specifically oriented against colleges and universities. These are all bills proposed since 2023. So this is a lot of movement in a very short time. And actually, I finalized this presentation a week ago. This is now out of date. They've added, even in the last few days, I noticed as I read the Chronicle this week. So, and you look at the headlines here, loss of confidence, loss of faith, defunding, all of this kind of embodies where we are in higher education at present, unfortunately. Okay. Now, undoubtedly, there are personal benefits to higher education. I think we all acknowledge that. Here's one that's frequently cited, and in case people say, is college really worth it? I would hope this would give a couple of reasons why the answer is yes, and these are very recent data. What you can see here, and these are from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, basically, the more highly educated you are, the more likely you are to be employed, and the more likely you are to command a higher salary. And so, yes, personal benefit, and that's all to the good. But that really doesn't tell the whole story. There are a lot of broader societal, non-economic benefits of higher education. And this slide is very busy, in part because the benefits, frankly, are so great. And so this, and I'll be citing a number of items that came out of the Post-Secondary Value Commission report and set of reports of about 3 years ago, 2.5, 3 years ago. But just to note some of these, higher education has been linked to the development of critical thinking skills. And all of these, by the way, are either established by the research or certainly have been inferred from the research. So there's a good, sound research basis. This isn't just opining, but it's based in actual research, a lot of it done by Georgetown University's Center on Education in the Workforce. So development of critical thinking skills. If you're more educated, you can engage in critical thinking and informed decision-making. Not a surprise. There's enhanced civic engagement. Voter rates go up among those who are more educated. More educated individuals are more likely to give back and work in their community to resolve issues and problems. There's heightened resistance to authoritarianism. Well, that seems like a pretty good thing. And so you have less tolerance of authoritarian perspectives if you are more highly educated. There's enhanced pluralistic orientation. It's been established that there is greater political and social tolerance, and hopefully not just tolerance, but acceptance, and also more egalitarian racial attitudes among those who are well educated. Positive health outcomes. If you're more highly educated, you're less likely to engage in unhealthy behaviors like smoking. You also have longer lifespans, longer healthy lifespans. That's a good thing. Lower levels of crime and incarceration, so safer societies. Benefits to the family structure. Now, people get married for very deeply personal reasons, but the literature says that the more highly educated you are, the more likely you are to have a marriage, and that is less likely to result in a divorce. Greater personal sense of agency and empowerment. You feel more in charge of your life. And last but not least on this list, positive correlation with increased happiness levels. These are not just, yes, they help the individual, but I think we would agree that these are things that help society more broadly. Okay, so that was the Post-Secondary Value Commission looked at higher education more broadly. The title of my talk, though, says public higher education, so you might ask, why should we care about public higher education? And so that's really the focus of this section of my presentation. The list is long. I picked about a handful, and so I'm just going to run through these. One of them that's near and dear to my heart is access. Public institution of higher education, so IHEs, enroll the very large majority of U.S. college students, and you can see that in this pie chart here. And so it's more than 80% of currently matriculated students in this country are engaged in public education. As well, it turns out that access and engagement in higher education is very dependent on one's financial circumstances, one's SES. And what we have here on the left, this is from the Brookings Institution. And so along the bottom is parental income quintile. 1 is low income, 5 is highest income, so increasing income over to the right. What you see here is that depending on one's parental financial circumstances, there are quite stark differences in how people access higher education. And so if you look here, and I should note that private four-year and public four-year are broken out. Two-year is not in this chart, but approximately 95% of students in two-year schools are public. So it's you can approximate the gray here is also representing public. So what you see here is the lower your family income, the more likely you are to find your place in public higher education. And by the way, fewer than half of students that are in this lowest quintile do access higher education at all. Fifth quintile, 92%. Vast difference. As well, And I have a few references in this talk to a big data analysis group that's now based out of Harvard. It's called Opportunity Insights these days. It started its life as the Equality of Opportunity Project. But they have looked at massive amounts of tax filings and college and individual data to come up with a series of really keen statistics and observations. And I just put this quote in there because it really puts in stark terms the differential that comes with access and one's SES. Children with parents in the top 1% of the income distribution are 77 times more likely to attend elite colleges and universities than children with parents in the bottom 20% of income distribution. Just think about that. Top 1 versus bottom 20. That really is a stark difference, and it kind of talks about access, and that's why publics are really so very important, because they increase access to individuals who might not otherwise find their way to higher education. Another reason, diversity. Public institutions of higher education serve the majority of Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, and low-income or Pell students. For those who are unfamiliar with the Pell program, that's a federal scholarship, a grant program that supports individuals of limited financial means. Okay, so this too is from the Post-Secondary Value Commission, and what you can see here are groups that, many of these groups are populations that have been underserved in higher education. AI or AN, American Indian or Alaska Native, AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander. And so you can see here, and I've lumped public 2 and 4 year here, you can see them split out if you wish, but for many of these underserved populations, public higher education is where they're accessing their educational opportunities. The same information is shown here graphically, which kind of highlights this a little bit more starkly. All the publics, they're double stacked here, 2 year in dark blue, 4 year in light blue, but you can see here that publics really serve a need for individuals who have been traditionally underrepresented and underserved in higher education relative to their private nonprofit counterparts and their private for-profit counterparts. Okay. Another reason, affordability. Public institutions of higher education have substantially lower net total net cost of attendance. And that's shown in this graphic here. So we have public institutions, the average cost of a 4-year degree, just under $83,000, private nonprofit, about $118,000, private for-profit, more expensive, $128,000. So there's a pretty stark difference there in the cost. Economic mobility is another reason why. Economic mobility is a term that refers to one's ability to improve one's SES, your socioeconomic status, over the course of your lifetime. And that is a good thing. We want higher education to be able to do that. Economic mobility, it turns out, public 4-year institutions have higher rates than their private counterparts. And that is shown in this graphic here. And so public, 68% meets this threshold as students earning enough to enter the 4th income quartile within 10 years of entry. So it's a measure of how much they were able to improve their financial circumstances within a period of time. And so public, 68, private, nonprofit, 64, private, for-profit, 56. You might say, well, gosh, Denise, that's not a huge difference. But remember, who is going 80%, 81.1% of individuals are served by public institutions. So there's a magnifying effect as well. A lot of under-resourced, those lowest income individuals are predominantly served in public. And so to have greater socioeconomic mobility, the ability to elevate one's SES, is magnified through both of those phenomena. Another reason, student debt, and we've certainly heard a lot about this in recent years. Public institutions of higher ed have lower total debt levels relative to their private nonprofit counterparts. And so that is, well, Actually, I'll start with this. For those who are wondering, why is this in the discourse? Why are so many individuals in society concerned about this and lawmakers as well? What you can see here from 2007 to 2022, so 15 years, the skyrocketing levels of debt relative to the numbers of borrowers. So that growing gap shows the increased debt load that is being shouldered by these students, and this is for federal student borrowers. And so this is part of the discourse, why it's such a problem, is that individuals, I thought my debt that took me 14 years post-graduation to pay off was a lot. I can only imagine what that looks like for individuals today. And so that is shown, the difference here is shown, here's public relative to private, nonprofit. This probably is a longer conversation, private for profit, and I think what it is this looks at students who used federal loans to attend college. This probably speaks to those accessing private for profit going to other means like private lenders, because their total debt load is actually, I think, on the order of $50,000 from this same source. Okay. Another reason that I would share is the student share. The escalating percentage of the cost of attendance is shouldered by students, and that really imperils everything else that's going on here. In short form, what's happening is with time, as there's greater doubt and questioning of the value of higher education, the perspective that it's not so much a societal benefit, but a personal one, society's been okay with the student shouldering more of the cost. States have retracted and defunded, disinvested in public higher education. And that's shown here. And so this is a graph from SHEO, the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, from 1980 to 2022 that shows their trajectory over time. So in 1980, the student share, the amount that students were having to self-fund through net tuition as a percentage of total education revenue, that was just under 21%. In round numbers, it's 42% across the U.S. today. So it's been shifting over time, even as the cost of higher education has been escalating, which is why we're seeing such a problem with student debt. Students can't afford that shift. And you might look here and say, well, but gosh, that looks like it's been getting pretty it's been going in the right direction lately, and that is true. Generally, as economies stabilize, states are able to put more money into public higher education, and that has helped shift that down. But the other factor I would say is, look where the start of the pandemic is. There was a lot of funding being plowed in through federal stimulus dollars. When the economy starts to moderate, this is almost certain to look a little different. If you look here, wherever there's a recession, generally there's an uptick in the student share. And so that is, one likes to not prognosticate, but that certainly seems like a feasible scenario. Okay, so you might be wondering in all this, talking to a UCLA audience, how does UCLA stack up in all this? And so I've taken a few, I looked into this a little bit and identified a few indicators of UCLA's success in terms of being, we know it's an excellent institution, how accessible and affordable is it? And so I've tried to capture that here. And so these are data from that, I mentioned before, Opportunity Insights, what's now called Opportunity Insights, what was then called the Equality of Opportunity Project. And so this is an accessible data source that you can look up today from the New York Times based on this project, and it's called the Mobility Report Cards. And so they went through, and for institutions of higher education, they did this analysis. And so I pulled up the data, and among 65 elite colleges, UCLA among them, my undergraduate alma mater is also among them, it is not in the top 10. And that's not a dig. I mean, it's just simply a matter of fact. It is not. And so at this time, and so this was based on, the publication was 2017. The data, of course, are backward looking, and I'll pick up on that in a moment. But what you can see here is among 65, UCLA was #1. I've seen banners all over campus. UCLA is #1. So there you go, another indicator that UCLA is #1. And what you see here is that the percentage of students from the bottom 40% by income, so the bottom 2 quintiles, 19.2%. That is the best of all these 65, and by quite a stretch, too. So that's an accomplishment, and that's really something that UCLA can be very proud of. This next slide shows a comparison against those other peer institutions. Again, mobility report cards. So this is based on, the publication came out in 2017. And so what you see here from student birth year 1980 to student birth year 1991, you see how UCLA is done. It's the dark line here. The yellowish green colors here are the peer institutions. And look at this, students from the bottom 60%, so low income to middle income households. These students have been well served by UCLA throughout this time. Rarely has anyone done better than UCLA during this time period. Students from the top 20%, UCLA is pretty consistently at the bottom. So that speaks to access, and that's a pretty proud tradition. Now, I will come back around to this. This is birth year, and so if you add 18, basically you get the year a traditional age student would have entered college. So these are data that are backward looking of necessity. And so the most recent year here, 1991, translates to students who entered UCLA in about 2009. If we pull back to 1980, it's 1998. So 98 to about 15 years ago here. And so this is a more recent analysis, different kind of analysis, but one that I would list to kind of encourage you to be very interested in this topic that we're speaking of today. This is also from the New York Times Magazine, and they regularly have come out, I think over the last decade, this may be the third over 10 years, come out with information where they look at the top U.S. colleges. So these are the 286 most selective U.S. colleges in the U.S., and they define greatest economic diversity by looking at the percentage of first-time, first-year students, freshman students, with Pell Grants. And so the overall average among these top 286 was 21%. So 21% of these students received Pell among these top colleges and universities. And over a 10-year period, because this was through 2021, it reduced a bit. This was the top, Berea College. That's very much tied to their mission, so that's not a shock. That's their point of pride is access. I pulled out, and I pulled up here all of the other University of California campuses that appear among that top 286. And what you see here is that UCLA is actually the lowest among them. It's 100 out of presumably 286. And so its freshman Pell share was just about right on the average. I will note that across higher education more broadly, the average Pell share among incoming students is 34%. So that gives you a sense of where UCLA is. The thing I would highlight for you, and hopefully something that would get you very interested in the conversation and supporting this at UCLA, is the direction that UCLA has gone. Over that 10-year period, the Pell percentage has gone down by 10 percentage points, which is not the direction you want if you're looking to support access. And so UCLA has had a sustained, excellent tradition of providing affordable access to a high-quality education. What I would say, though, is that this is a little worrisome, that these more recent data suggest it's going in a different direction than one might want to support the prominence and the success that UCLA has logged. Okay, so I am going to close tonight with an invitation and an exhortation, if I've been subtle about where I'm looking to go here. This is a quote, and again, this is for all those University of Michigan connected people in the room. This is another University of Michigan president, more recent president, Mary Sue Coleman, who was also president of the Association of American Universities, which is a select research-oriented, top research institutions in the country organization. This was delivered in her address, Saving Public Higher Education, and this was in 2016, so this is not a new conversation. And so her quote is, "We are, I believe, at a tipping point. The question is, which way public higher education will fall and who will do the pushing?" What I will say to you is that we all, everybody in this room, benefits from public higher education. If you're a student, you're getting your education here. You're clearly benefiting from public higher education. If you're a faculty member, staff member, administrator, you have the opportunity to advance your career courtesy of a public higher education institution. If you're a community member, you partake in events like this. You go to cultural events, you engage, you participate, or are the beneficiaries of service outreach engagement opportunities that UCLA puts out there in the world. All of us who are citizens benefit from the technological, the medical, the innovations that come out of public higher education institutions. There's also the economic impact. I meant to look up and I forgot to do it, darn it. I know in SUNY, we look at what the return on investment is. For every dollar that's invested into SUNY, we give back, in terms of economic impact, almost $9. We're a great investment. And so we all benefit from higher education. What I would suggest to you, I'm here as a public higher education president. It's part of my job to go out there and extol the virtues of higher education more broadly and public higher education specifically. People expect me to do that. What's more powerful, though, is all of us who are benefiting from public higher education if we're all doing that as well. Far more powerful than the presidents out there making this pitch. So my urge to you, my invitation and my exhortation to you is that you join me in being among those who are doing the pushing to make sure that public higher education goes in the right direction, that it's funded, that it's supported, that the value of it is more broadly known, and thereby advance what is truly a public good. So with that, I will wrap up my comments, but take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Denise, for that. Very important message. We have a little bit of time for questions. So if you have a question for Denise, you can use the microphone there in the center aisle. And Denise, you can stay.
Yeah. I have one question rather than going to the microphone. I noticed it's wonderful that lower socioeconomic people are accepted going to UCLA, but I was surprised at the reverse. The right graph on that chart. Why would it be that affluent people, so to speak, this one.
The top 20%?
Yes. In other words, what is the range?
So what, and sorry if I didn't explain this. So this would be from the top quintile, and what this says is that UCLA throughout this time period, so roughly what I say, 1998 to 15 years ago, that UCLA was among the lowest in terms of students from the top 20%. So not picking from the wealthy class, or certainly there are students here who come from the top quintile. It's just in aggregate, this was lower than many. I think at the time, the average family income for UCLA was $104,900 was the average, and so that was lower than its fellow, what I think probably 65 peer schools. that were pulling higher SES students.
It's just surprising that more affluent people wouldn't choose to come, too, because of its educational status.
And my guess is when you go to this, my guess is that those data lag. So they lag by about 15 years. And so 1991, those are students who would have started coming to UCLA in 2009, that data point. Here, it would be 1998. So throughout that time period, UCLA was a leader. The data end there. And so I don't have what's happening now, but what it suggests is that because there has been a fairly sizable drop in the Pell, it suggests that that might not be the case today, that it might be that that's shifting. And so that's perfectly possible. That is what I would speculate, but I don't have the data.
Okay, just come to the microphone. But Victoria, or yeah, go since you're closer, and then Victoria.
I was just going to comment that maybe it has something to do with the students getting into UCLA, or maybe it's hard. It's a very hard institution to get into.
Yes.
And some private schools, if there's a connection, it might be easier for them to go there.
Yeah, and I don't know what the dynamics are, but it clearly has been a strength of UCLA through the years that the campus has done its utmost to attract students who were from lower SES backgrounds, which is a wonderful thing.
So I'm going to change the topic a little bit, which is, it is concerning that there's been a decline. Yeah, I just have to talk loud. It's concerning there's been a decline in the support for higher education, public higher education. And certainly California, we still support higher education more than many, many states.
Absolutely.
Yet it has declined. So I'll just say one hypothesis, one explanation that has been suggested to me, and I'd like to see your comment to it, and maybe have others. But one of the comments is, as you showed, that 80% figure, which is the increase in lower income, the increase in BIPOC diversity, the increase in women, as more people have taken advantage of the public cares less about supporting those groups, and therefore they consider the value and the investment in public education. Because back in the days when California was really supporting it, the percentage of not necessarily UCLA, but the percentage in the state was in fact going to higher income individuals. Do you have any other hypotheses or explanations or reactions to that?
That is a very astute observation, and it's not the first time I've heard that hypothesis put out there, is that as the demographics have shifted and those who tend to be in power and have resources are less reflective of the where the demographics are going, that's been proffered as a rationale, is that as higher education has served a broader population, the folks who control the purse strings are less interested in investing in it, which would be a sad thing. I would certainly hope that's not the case.
I'm going to do a follow-up, because you want all of us to be ambassadors for
Yes.
this cause. So what is our strategy going to be? Because in some ways, the anti-intellectualism that's been going on in the last 5 to 10 years is only going to further devalue education. So we have sort of a decline in the care about supporting all of this, our citizenry, and actually a decline in the value of intellectual pursuits. So what do you think is the strategy for everyone? How should they be putting their efforts to fight this? Because obviously we all agree that public education is extremely important. But do you?
Great question. And part of what I was looking to do is to provide tangible, quotable statistics and facts about why higher education is useful beyond the individual. And so I would say if it's not just the president's, but it's individuals, all of us in the room, who benefit from this experience, articulating that and sharing that with your neighbors, with your elected officials, when you go to the polls and saying, you know what, the folks who are saying that they see the value in investing in higher education, supporting that and advancing that. But I think we all have to be out there talking about the value that higher education brings to a broader society, or folks will just say, no, we don't need to. There are other things. And there are many other competing needs, and that's the difficulty. That's why you saw in that chart that showed the gray recession areas, when economies are good, states can afford to invest. It's when the economies stagnate or turn down, there's a downturn, that states retract. And that is why we have such a burgeoning student share.
Okay, one more question. Yeah, come on.
Yeah, I guess I also just want to ask about like what public means. I just pulled up the UCLA annual report, and there's just like a sliver from like the state educational appropriation. So it doesn't actually have a percentage, but it's definitely like generously 20, but probably closer to 15. So I feel like that's a huge thing that like I feel like all of us need to advocate for, as far as UC Regents, blah, 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 et cetera. But then also that then of course falls onto what you mentioned about the student share. And I think like the student debt aspect of this is like such a huge element, because although we see all of these amazing correlations between income, blah, 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 but like, my question about that is like, does that take into consideration the debt that current students, because it wasn't super measurable, student debt wasn't super measurable until like 1999. So probably like majority of folks in here don't have like loads of student debt compared to like the students that are actively in school right now. And they can have high income, but that may not, take into account the ballooning debt, because any debt from the federal government, the Department of Education, has like a non-negotiable interest rate of like just crazy time. Like it's like anywhere between like 7 and 9%. I
was paying 9% on my loans, which is in part, it wasn't a lot of money, but it took a lot of time to pay.
If you think about like a typical student undergrad going in, taking on debt, whatever they need to get through like $80,000, as you mentioned up here, and then like you're 20 whatever, having like 8%, 9% non-negotiable interest rate, like there's no, very few people are going to be able to like make a dent in that.
Right.
So those two things combined like just seem like such a challenging environment.
It is, and so your point about how do you define public, as states have reduced their contribution to public higher education, the IHEs have had little recourse but to increase their tuition and fees. And so that then pushes it onto the consumer, the student, the families. And so there are certainly public institutions that are deemed public, but they're getting less than 10% of their funds from the state. There have actually been some who are like, hey, let's call ourselves independent because you're just not giving us enough. And what's really interesting is that there's a phenomenon where it feels as if as states retract their support, the accountability for the funds that are coming in has been heightened. So there's more compliance, there's more reporting. I was talking to some colleagues today about how can we get away from, it was basically administrative bloat. And I realize I'm a president, so I guess I'm the embodiment of administrative bloat. But part of this is there's greater compliance and accountability because there are so few discretionary resources. Those that are putting funds our way really want to make sure they're getting their money's worth. And so we have more reporting and compliance and data compilation demands, which only adds to the overhead of a university. So it's a challenge, and certainly having states put more money into their public institutions, that means that we can help our students not bear such a disproportionate burden, which many of them can't, which drive them to loans.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to come up to?
Do you have a personal sweet spot as to what fraction the student at a public institution should
Oh, what a great question. I mean, I believe back in the day, the University of California didn't charge tuition at all, right? It was just fees. They charged the fees, but it was tuition. Oh, still don't. Okay, all right. So it's kind of a semantic. I don't have in mind an ideal. I just know that what's happening now is not sustainable, and that progressive march toward more and more going to the students. I mean, what you're seeing is individuals who are looking at debt that it's going to take their career before they can hope to pay down their debt. And things like home ownership, moving out from their parents' homes is kind of a pipe dream, and that's not good for society. And so I don't have a perfect number. I would say certainly the 42% that it has approached most recently is not sustainable, and that's why we have such a high amount of attention on the student loan debt crisis in this country, because it's overwhelming people.